I do think that we have enough evidence to form a coherent, consistent narrative about the Reynolds Affair. This is not a talk full of sex.
Alexander Hamilton and the Reynolds Affair, a three-part moral and political account. Let's welcome Dr. Durante.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all for coming out. It feels like Valley Forge out there, so I appreciate that you came out. Alexander Hamilton has been my favorite founding father since Truno's biography came out in 2004. And in 2016-17, as Rand said, I wrote 70 or so blog posts that painted a picture of Hamilton's life by way of writings of Hamilton, his family, his friends, his colleagues, and his enemies. It started out from frustration that I could not afford tickets to the musical. And it went on for a year and a half because I found that I enjoyed his company very much. For the blog posts, the only part of his life that I did not look forward to investigating was the Reynolds Affair. Either he had an adulterous affair, which was a betrayal of Eliza, or he was doing something financially dishonest. Either way, I thought this was going to be Hamilton's feat of clay. And my husband said, so why are you looking at the Reynolds Affair at all? Why would you do this if you think it's going to upset you? After all, Eliza didn't throw him out of the house. She didn't divorce him. He didn't lose the respect of his friends or his colleagues. It didn't harm his career. A year later, he was Inspector General of the Army. That's not a bad step up. It comes down to, I like sculptures, and I prefer to have them on solid pedestals rather than quicksand. And if you start squeezing your eyes shut and pretending not to see things, that's the most direct route to quicksand. So I do think that we have enough evidence to form a coherent, consistent narrative about the Reynolds Affair. It's always possible that new evidence might turn up, and then we'd have to change the interpretation. But that's part of the fun of being a historian, that you find new information and you change your narrative. So I decided to approach the Reynolds Affair by collecting and reading every relevant document in chronological order. There are more than 60 of them, and even excerpted, they take up 75 pages in Volume 2 of Hamilton, A Friend to America. So I'm going to tell you the plan for tonight. I'm going to tell you first briefly my interpretation of the whole affair so that you can decide while you're listening to me whether you agree, whether you think it fits the facts. Then I'm going to run through the primary sources and the context. And finally, I'm going to look briefly at the aftermath of the Reynolds Affair. So let me set your expectations with 4 caveats. The first, this is not a talk full of sex. If you came here for the salacious details, the exits are there and there. I'm very sorry. Number 2, this is not an analysis in terms of gender, religion, race, politics, or socioeconomic status. I grew up long ago and far away, and I still have a quaint habit of assuming that adults have free will, and they make their own choices, and you should hold them responsible for them. If this really bothers you, you should consider this your trigger warning. The exits are there and there. Third caveat, I don't have a conspiracy theory. There are eminent scholars who believe that Hamilton forged all the letters that are attributed to James and Maria Reynolds in order to hide his nefarious deeds as Secretary of the Treasury. I think there are too many independent witnesses for that to hold water. So I'm going to assume that all the early documents are real, but I will give far more weight to the eyewitness accounts. So if you're hoping for a conspiracy theory. And fourth, I am not focusing on Lin-Manuel Miranda's interpretation of the Reynolds Affair, although I will mention it at the end of the talk. I am, as Rand said, both a historian and an art historian, and I get very cranky about keeping the lines drawn between those two. So if as a historian you're going to criticize Lin-Manuel Miranda's content, then fair's fair. You ought to do it in meter and rhyme. So, here is my interpretation of the Reynolds Affair. It falls into three phases: the private, the political, and the public. Phase one, the private phase, goes from mid-1791 to mid-1792. In this phase, James Reynolds and his wife Maria pick Hamilton as a target for blackmail, choose the moment, and carry it through. Phase two is a few months later, starts in November 1792, runs into January 1793. This is the political turn. At this point, James Reynolds and a crony of his are arrested for defrauding the government. And James Reynolds tries to wriggle out of jail by saying that Hamilton was in cahoots with him on financial chicanery of some sort. Hamilton convinces James Monroe and two other congressmen that he had been paying money to James Reynolds, but it was for blackmail after having an affair with Reynolds' wife, and not for something nefarious in financial dealings. The third phase is the public phase, 5 years later, 1797. In this phase, James Callender, a journalist, published some of the documents from 1792 as part of a political attack on the Federalists and their leader. He declares that Hamilton must have been doing something financially nefarious. And at this point, 1797, Hamilton cannot get James Monroe to state that he disagrees with Callender. So Hamilton publishes his own version of events, and that is the Reynolds pamphlet. So I'm arguing that in the first phase, Hamilton was the target for blackmailers, and in phases 2 and 3, we're looking at mostly Democratic Republican attacks on the Federalists, at least as much as attacks on Hamilton's personal morals or honor. Okay. So on we go to phase 1, summer 1791 to August 1792, a private affair. The context for this at the national level is that Hamilton is working on his three-part plan to fund the government and to help Americans become prosperous, to flourish in today's terminology. January 1790, he submits his report on public credit. That's the first part of his financial plan. December 1790, he submits the report on a national bank. That's the second part of the financial plan. After a dispute with Thomas Jefferson, between Jefferson and Hamilton, Washington signs the bank bill. And in July 1791, the stock for the Bank of the U.S. goes on sale in Philadelphia. Now, this is not some obscure government transaction that nobody heard of. Why? Well, suppose you're in the U.S. in the 1790s and you're making money. What are you going to do with it? To keep it safe, maybe even earn you a little interest. In the whole country, there are 3 banks, 1, 2, 3 banks. There are family-owned businesses, so you can't just buy into those. There are no publicly owned corporations, so there's no stock market. The Bank of the United States was expected to pay really solid dividends to those who owned stock in it. And people poured into Philadelphia hoping to buy this stock. And in fact, it sold out on the very first day that it was offered. Hamilton, as the creator of the Bank of the U.S., is a very prominent figure in Philadelphia in the summer of 1791. That summer, he is handling all the usual business of the Treasury Department. He is also managing the details of the Bank of the U.S. stock offering, which is not a small thing because there may have been 5 Americans, maybe 10, who had any idea how to set up a corporation, something that would exist before and after the individuals who set it up, or after the individuals who set it up. So he can't hand that job off. He is also collecting enormous amounts of data for the report on manufacturers, which is the third part of his plan. Even for Hamilton, who usually runs on overdrive, it is a busy and stressful time. Now, we're going to switch to the personal level. I'm sorry to remind you that there are people who hang around the seat of government looking for easy money, looking for scams to run, bribes to collect, blackmail to extort, insider information to somehow profit from. So suppose you're in a blackmailer's shoes. What person in Philadelphia are you going to target? Well, the most prominent figures are George Washington, the president, and his cabinet, Jefferson, Knox, and Hamilton. And among those, you gotta say Hamilton looks the most vulnerable. At 34, he is the youngest by almost a decade. And thinking like a blackmailer, he's younger, maybe he's a little more impulsive, not quite as wise, not quite as experienced. Also, he's Secretary of the Treasury. He handles a lot of money, and he makes the rules for accounting for it. So you think, maybe he can make some of that disappear into my pocket. He has also been married for 11 years to Elizabeth Schuyler. And most of us have read the letters between Eliza and Alexander. It's pretty clear that they loved each other. But, thinking like a blackmailer, Hamilton gained a lot of political connections from his marriage. And maybe he would be willing to pay to keep secrets that would anger his influential in-laws. Also, Hamilton lives in Center City, Philadelphia. If you know Philadelphia, it's South 3rd and Walnut. And he walks pretty much every day to the Treasury and the Bank of the United States, which are nearby. So, thinking as a blackmailer, it's pretty easy to run into Hamilton. Also thinking as a blackmailer, Alexander and Eliza are known for being kind. One of the talks that are probably not going to happen at the Grange would have talked about that. But you're a blackmailer, you think, a sob story, he might fall for that. And also, for the 2 months starting mid-July 1791, Hamilton is all alone in Philadelphia. During the summer of 1791, the very first one that Congress spent in Philadelphia rather than New York, Eliza and the kids went to the Schuyler home in Albany, New York. Eliza and their youngest son had been very ill the spring before, and summer in a port city, no clean water, no modern medicines, was not a healthy place to be. So they go off to Albany. Okay, we're done with Hamilton as a potential victim. Let me introduce you to James Reynolds. James Reynolds first appears on the record solo without his father in 1789. Hamilton's friend Robert Troup in New York said that James Reynolds was an honest, industrious man. And that is the last time that anyone says anything nice about James Reynolds. A year later, he is doing something that I personally consider reprehensible. Here's the background. In August 1790, Congress, which was still in New York City, passed Hamilton's funding bill. So 9 years after the Battle of Yorktown, it is finally certain that the federal government is going to pay its IOUs from the Revolutionary War. For 9 years, has not been at all certain. Many of those IOUs were held by soldiers who had fought the battle for independence for no pay, just a slip of paper that said, we'll pay you someday. Over the years, these soldiers were often willing to sell their IOUs for pennies on the dollar, because pennies now is better than nothing ever. In the summer of 1790, when the funding bill was passed, or maybe just about to, a New York City merchant hires James Reynolds to travel to the distant reaches of Virginia and North Carolina. His assignment is to purchase IOUs cheaply before the veterans there learn that they will be paid in full. This is not illegal. Hamilton actually defended the right of secondary purchasers of IOUs to be paid in full. That's the discrimination issue. But I find something very reprehensible about buying up these IOUs from the vets cheaply when you happen to know that they're soon going to be paid in full. So he's lying and cheating vets of money that they literally risked their lives for. In my book, that makes James Reynolds already a bad man by 1790. In late 1790 or early 1791, James Reynolds follows Congress to Philadelphia. He is by then married for 8 years to Maria. Maria is related to the Livingstons of New York, which is a respectable family in New York with good connections. She probably has proper manners. As an art historian, I want to point out this is not a portrait of Maria Reynolds. Portraits at this point are very expensive. I used an anonymous French woman just to have a figure on the advertisement. It's an artist named Caffieri. At any rate, Maria is 23, and she and James have a daughter who is 6 years old. And she rents a house 2 blocks away from Alexander Hamilton. And now we come to the affair. In July 1791, after much anticipation, the stock of the Bank of the US goes on sale. During that busy, stressful summer, Maria Reynolds visits Hamilton's home and introduces herself. This is how Hamilton describes it in the Reynolds pamphlet. He says he talked to her in a separate room so as not to disturb his family, which means it had to be before mid-July when Eliza and the children went off to Albany. Hamilton says, quote, "Her husband, who for a long time had treated her very cruelly, had lately left her to live with another woman, and in so destitute a condition that though desirous of returning to her friends, she had not the means." End of quote. So Hamilton promises to get her some money and to bring it to her later. Remember, they don't have ATMs at this point, so you have to do something to get money. When he brought the money to her, she led him into her bedroom, where it was, quote, quickly apparent that other than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. End of quote. People, not just one gender or the other, people make bad choices when they're under stress. And Hamilton made a very bad choice. He slept with Maria Reynolds. In the Reynolds pamphlet, he says that he slept with her frequently, often in his own house. So I would deduce from that that Eliza is gone by this point, because if you've ever been in a house with 4 small children, you're not carrying on with a strange woman in the bedroom. Why would he sleep with her in his own house? Well, either he's extremely crass and insensitive, and I don't see evidence of that in his writings and his other behavior, or Maria talked him into it because that would make for a lot better leverage later when they were putting the pressure on him. Because slept with another woman in our bed is worse than had an affair someplace else. All right. So Maria soon told Hamilton that her husband wanted to reconcile with her, and Hamilton advised her to do that. And then she told him that James Reynolds was engaged in speculation. She doesn't say what, but we need to stop here and talk about speculation, because this is the nefarious financial behavior that Hamilton was accused of. Speculation, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is the action or practice of buying and selling goods, lands, stocks and shares, etc., in order to profit by the rise or fall in the market value. If that was illegal, most of us would be in jail. And if it was immoral, most of us would be going to the bad place. By the 1770s, speculation came to mean specifically engagement in any business transaction of a venturesome or risky nature, but offering the chance of great or unusual gain. Now, again, back in 1790s America, the financial system is very primitive, and there are really only 2 ways that you could do risky business and make a lot of money. You could either buy government land and sell it at a profit, which is kind of long-term process and leaves a paper trail of deeds and titles, or you could buy government IOUs and sell them at a profit. Buying IOUs cheap was what James Reynolds was doing in New York City for that merchant, so he was speculating. And again, both of those types of speculation are legal, although I consider James Reynolds' version reprehensible. So back to our story. Maria tells Hamilton that James Reynolds was engaged in speculation. If she said what it was that James Reynolds was doing, Hamilton didn't record it. And she tells Hamilton that James might give him information about Treasury employees who were engaging in speculation. So she's playing on Hamilton's kindness. She's a damsel in distress. She needs his help. And she's playing on his determination to keep the Treasury Department honest, which we know from other sources. It is not legal for a member of the Treasury Department, including Alexander Hamilton, to be giving out information about these IOUs or acting in a way that will make a profit. Reynolds gives Hamilton the name of an employee who gave him information, which he shouldn't have done. It is, I think, not coincidentally, the name of an employee who is gone from the Treasury Department. And then James Reynolds asks Hamilton for a job. Giving James Reynolds a job at the Treasury Department is like renting a fox, a room in your henhouse. Among other things, it would give him access to all sorts of lists of veterans to whom the government owes money. Hamilton says he's starting to hear bad things about James Reynolds, so he made no promises. He spoke kind of vaguely. At this point, Hamilton starts to suspect that James and Maria are playing him, and he wants to end the affair. But Maria seems to be in such, quote, agonizing distress, unquote, at the idea of not seeing him, that he decides he should taper it off. He should stop seeing her gradually. And the next stage is the blackmail. Back to the political context. In early December 1791, Hamilton submits the report on manufactures, and the Bank of the U.S. opens for business. It's another busy, stressful time, and the Reynoldses have seen that Hamilton is vulnerable when he's stressed and busy. The first time they caught him, he slept with Maria. So James Reynolds hasn't gotten his job at Treasury, and he tries a different tack to make money. The first letters that we have from James and Maria are dated in mid-December. This is Maria's letter. I want to give you the flavor of her writing. She says, "My husband sent you a letter this morning, and he has swore that if you do not answer it, or if he does not hear from you today, he will write Mrs. Hamilton. He has just gone out, and I'm alone. I think you had better come here one moment that you may know the cause, then you will the better know how to act. I wish I had never been born to give you so much unhappiness." That's Maria. Same day, James writes to Hamilton, "I'm very sorry to find out that I have been so cruelly treated by a person that I took to be my best friend, instead of that my greatest enemy. She says there's no other man that she cares for in this world. I am determined to have satisfaction. It shan't be only one family that's miserable. Now, sir, if I can't see you at your house, call and see me, for there is no person that knows anything as yet." In this letter, and his next one, James pushes all Hamilton's buttons. He says, "You are not a man of honor. I want satisfaction. You've stolen my wife's love, and I'm going to tell your wife." Do you feel a little sorry for James Reynolds? Maybe. Well, within a week, he switches from, "I'm going to tell your wife," to, "Pay me $1,000, and I'll take my daughter and leave town, and you can have Maria." Does anybody know what Hamilton's salary is as Secretary of the Treasury?
About $3,500.
It is $3,500 a year. So James is demanding 4 months of his annual income. As opposed to Washington and Jefferson, for instance, Hamilton has no secondary income. He doesn't have property to sell. He doesn't have any inherited money. But he paid it somehow in 2 installments. And James Reynolds didn't leave town. Hamilton says that he did not visit Maria in the early part of 1792, after the blackmail started. But he did have a few undated letters from Maria that hinted at suicide. She said, "I've been on the point of doing the most horrid acts. For God's sake, be not so void of all humanity as to deny me this last request." March, Panic of 1792. The panic was largely brought on by the actions of William Dwyer? Is that how? Dewar, thank you. Who had, like the Scotch, is it? Dewar, okay. The panic was largely brought on by the actions of William Dewar, who had resigned from the Treasury and was in New York City trying to make quick bucks by speculating on government land and government IOUs. When Dewar went broke, the price of government IOUs would have plummeted if Hamilton hadn't quietly propped the price up. So he had another couple very, very busy weeks. He's vulnerable when he's under stress. He slept with Maria in the summer of 1791. He paid blackmail in December 1791. Panic of 1792 hits, and here come the Reynoldses again. Maria has hinted at suicide already. On March 24th, she does it again. I am doomed to drink the bitter cup of affliction, pure and unmixed. Comply with this last request. James Reynolds on the same day. Maria was much more cheerful after you visited. Come again soon. And 10 days later, he's asking Hamilton for yet another loan. So the $1,000 payment was not the end of the blackmail. In early June, Maria complains that Hamilton has not visited her. Oh, Colonel Hamilton, what have I done that you should thus neglect? I am now alone, and shall be for a few days, and would wish to see you this evening, if possible. That's the last letter we have from Maria. But Hamilton kept lending James Reynolds money until August, and it came to another 2 months of Hamilton's salary as Secretary of the Treasury. This is the end of phase 1, and it's a good time to stop and ask, when did Hamilton actually stop sleeping with Maria Reynolds rather than occasionally visiting her? Nobody actually says. In the Reynolds pamphlet, he says he wanted to stop seeing her, not just sleeping with her, but even seeing her, even before the blackmail letters started in December 1791. So I think the physical affair might very well have ended when his family returned in September to Philadelphia. It would certainly be harder to have Eliza not notice him sleeping with somebody else in their bed. If it didn't end when Eliza returned, then it probably ended with that first blackmail letter in December 1791, because sleeping with Maria after that point would have just been giving more ammunition to a blackmailer, and Hamilton is not stupid. I don't think he would have done that. It's interesting to ask when Eliza found out. I read somewhere and didn't have time to follow it up that she was the family bookkeeper, that she kept the books of the Hamilton family the way that Hamilton kept the books of the country. If so, I know in my family I could not make half of my annual income disappear without my husband noticing something. So I think that she probably knew pretty early on. I think that the consequences, the blackmail payments, went on for much longer than the physical affair did. But we don't know that for sure. Okay, end of phase 1. I'm on time. This is good. Phase 2 goes from November 1792 to January 1793. This is where the affair turns political. By 1792, 2 political parties have emerged in the U.S. Jefferson is leader of the Democratic Republicans. Hamilton is leading the Federalists. In August 1792, Washington tells Jefferson and Hamilton that their political fighting is, quote, harrowing and tearing our vitals, and will you please stop? And they do not stop. This matters because I don't think that Hamilton's affair would have turned into a political issue or public knowledge if there had not been these 2 violently opposed political factions. But let's go back to the Reynoldses. In late 1792, James and Maria are still in Philadelphia, and James is blackmailing Hamilton into August 1792. But he has other irons in the fire. James and his friend, crony, Jacob Clingman, get their hands on a list of veterans to whom the government owes money. They have acquired this from someone in the Treasury Department, which is illegal. They pretend to be the executors of the estate of one of these veterans, which is illegal. They collect $400 from the government, which is illegal. The veteran turns out to be very much alive and raises a ruckus. In mid-November 1792, Clingman and Reynolds are arrested, charged with defrauding the government. James Reynolds goes to jail, and Clingman gets out on bail. James Reynolds asks someone to deliver a letter to Alexander Hamilton, and I'm sure that he's hoping Hamilton will say something to get him out of jail. Hamilton tells the bearer, quote, that Reynolds and Clingman had been doing something very bad, and he advises the bearer not to have anything to do with them. So Reynolds is stuck in jail, and Clingman is still facing charges of fraud. They change their tactics. the two of them talk to Oliver Wolcott, who is the comptroller of the Treasury under Hamilton. He seems to be his second in command at this point. And they tell Wolcott, if you drop the charges, we will give the money back, and we will tell you who gave us that list of veterans. So notice that Reynolds and Clingman, they're admitting that they're guilty. There's no question that they did this scam. And while James Reynolds is still in prison, before action is taken on this, he writes to Wolcott, and he says, I'm paraphrasing because the literal one is very convoluted. He says, my wife told you I said I could make some heads of departments tremble. I never said that, just that I could make some clerk in Treasury who gave out the lists tremble. And you would normally ignore this as hearsay, right? It's just, he said that, she said that, okay. But within the next week, the fact that James Reynolds has something on Hamilton is repeated 4 more times in depositions that these people make. So Reynolds and Clingman are pulling every possible string to free themselves of this charge of fraud. Clingman contacts his ex-employer, Frederick Muhlenberg. Muhlenberg is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's a Federalist who later becomes a Democratic Republican. Clingman tells Muhlenberg, Reynolds says, quote, he has it in his power to hang the secretary, that Hamilton was deeply concerned in speculation, end of quote. And Muhlenberg decides that he should consult some friends about what Clingman has told him. Now, this is the point where things turn political. He consults Abraham Venable, member of the House of Representatives from Virginia, a Democratic Republican, and James Monroe, senator from Virginia, a Democratic Republican. Monroe studied law with Thomas Jefferson, and he has been Jefferson's friend and protege for 12 years at this point. When I was preparing this talk, I kept cutting it to an hour, and then it would suddenly be an hour and a half, and I cut it back, and it was an hour and a half. And it was all because of this next section. We can reconstruct day by day, from depositions made at the time, what Muhlenberg, Monroe, and Venable said or had told them from Clingman and James and Maria Reynolds. But those three, Clingman, James, Maria, don't say, I did this, I saw this, I said this. It's always, he told me he or she said or did this or that. And if you need an example, the most convoluted, I'm giving it to Jacob Clingman for a statement of December the 13th. You can look it up. These are the most important points. They are repeated multiple times between the statements of James, Maria, and Clingman. James Reynolds has hold over Hamilton. They never say what. And Hamilton has been speculating. Clingman says that Reynolds says that Hamilton made $30,000. But again, there are no specifics of who, why, what, where, how. The only evidence they've got for this is receipts for certain small amounts that Hamilton gave to James Reynolds. It's like a check with the memo field blank. So Reynolds, Clingman, they return the money that they got fraudulently, and they give Wolcott the name of the dishonest clerk in the Treasury Department. The charges are dropped, and Reynolds immediately flees town. No more talking to Reynolds. The day after Muhlenberg, Monroe, and Venable talked either jointly or separately to James, Maria, and Clingman, they went to see Alexander Hamilton. And they showed him the receipts for these small amounts paid to James Reynolds. And they told him that they suspected him of improper pecuniary association with Reynolds. They have no details, of course. And we are going to tell the president on you. Hamilton tells them that the receipts they've got in hand were for blackmail payments after Hamilton had an affair with James Reynolds' wife. And as evidence, he shows them the letters from James and Maria, of which I've just read you excerpts. According to later statements by Hamilton, by Wolcott, who was there at Hamilton's invitation, by Muhlenberg, by Venable, at this time, in December 1792, all three of these congressmen were satisfied that Hamilton had committed adultery and paid blackmail, but had not engaged in any financial skullduggery. And Hamilton probably thought that the matter was resolved at this point, but it wasn't quite. There were 2 more documents written, and they were signed by James Monroe alone. These 2 are quoted by James Callender in 1797 and are what ultimately caused the Reynolds Affair to become public. So, one day after the meeting between Hamilton and Muhlenberg, Monroe, and Venable, Monroe alone wrote and signed a statement. I'm giving you an excerpt of this. Last night we waited on Colonel Hamilton when he informed us of a particular connection with Mrs. R. and the frequent supplies of money to her and her husband on that account. He showed a great number of letters from Reynolds and herself. We left him under an impression our suspicions were removed. Well, that's a little bit ambiguous, isn't it? We left him under an impression our suspicions were removed. 2 weeks later, Monroe, again Monroe alone, wrote a note of a meeting that he had with Clingman. Clingman had visited Maria Reynolds after Hamilton had been cleared of these charges. And Monroe is recounting what Clingman said. Maria said, okay. Maria appeared much shocked at it and wept immoderately that he had been cleared. That she denied the imputation and declared that it had been a fabrication of Colonel Hamilton and that her husband had joined in it. Clingman was of opinion she was innocent and that the defense was an imposition, a lie. And again, it's ambiguous. Monroe doesn't say what he believes here, but he thought it was important enough to write it down and preserve it, didn't he? Okay, that is the end of phase 2. And now we're at phase 3, the public affair. Quick 2-minute look. This starts in July 1797, but I want to do a 2-minute look at the political situation after Hamilton met with, it sounds like a Broadway troupe, Muhlenberg, Monroe, and Venable in December 1792. From 1793 to 1797, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists are at odds on every imaginable issue, Democrat, domestic, and foreign. And that includes which side to take in the war between Great Britain and France, and what to do about the Whiskey Rebellion. As part of this partisan politics, there are 2 investigations of Hamilton's actions as Secretary of the Treasury. 1793, there's an investigation at the instigation of the Democratic Republicans. They accused him of using the wrong funds to pay domestic versus foreign debts. They're not explicitly accusing him of actually walking off with any money, but they say this wasn't right. And he goes through all the paperwork and they say, okay, that's all right. There are still enemies who are insisting that he's doing something nefarious, speculating somehow. So in 1794, they investigate him again at Hamilton's own insistence. Congress, which includes many, many of his political enemies, looks carefully at his reports. They look at his bank accounts, both office and personal, and they clear him both times. And jumping 15 years ahead, under Jefferson in 1801, Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin did an exhaustive investigation of Hamilton's time as Secretary of the Treasury. And they again found no evidence of wrongdoing on his part. So if you're a conspiracy theorist, if you want to go with the idea that he was speculating rather than committing adultery, then you have to explain why there's no evidence that he made any money, despite 3 really thorough investigations by his political opponents. This is a really primitive financial system, as I said before. You can't just take some money and wire it to a Swiss bank account. You can't send it to an offshore account in the Caymans. His enemies would have noticed if he'd been buying up real estate or luxury goods. And he died in debt, which makes no sense if he'd been squirreling away tens of thousands of dollars. Unless Eliza just forgot to look under the mattress and that's where it all was. Okay. As of January 31st, 1795, Hamilton resigns as Secretary of the Treasury, goes back to New York, starts practicing law again. He is still the leader of the Federalist Party. 1795, he writes 28 essays defending the Jay Treaty. 1796, he helps Washington draft the farewell address. 1797, he's advising Adams's cabinet, including Walcott, who is now Secretary of the Treasury. The trigger for the Reynolds Affair coming back into view, becoming public, is James Monroe. In 1794, Washington sent Monroe to France with the instructions that he was to make France treat us as a neutral power. Stop attacking our ships. And word gets back to Washington eventually that Monroe is just being really, really friendly with the French. And he's criticizing Jay's treaty, and he's criticizing George Washington. So late in 1796, just before Washington leaves office, he tells Monroe, get back here. He recalls him. And now James Callender steps on the stage. Callender is a journalist, and he is fervently in favor of the Democratic Republicans. Early in summer 1797, Callender publishes a series of pamphlets. They're under the title, The History of the U.S. in 1796. The early pamphlets of the history are kind of meandering attacks on the Federalists, especially on Jay's Treaty and on Great Britain. And then in late June, he publishes two pamphlets that attack Hamilton specifically as a man and as Secretary of the Treasury. These are the main points of Callender's attack. Callender says that he is publishing because of Hamilton's attacks on Monroe's behavior as Minister of France. He says these attacks are, quote, cowardly because Monroe is absent. They're unjust because his conduct will bear the strictest enquiry. They are ungrateful because he, Monroe, displayed on an occasion that will be mentioned immediately the greatest lenience to Mr. Alexander Hamilton, the prime mover of the federal party. Callender says that when Muhlenberg, Monroe, and Venable discussed the letters of James and Maria Reynolds with Hamilton, Hamilton, quote, entreated in the most anxious tone of deprecation that the measure might be suspended. Mr. Monroe was one of the three gentlemen who agreed to this delay. They gave their consent to it on Hamilton's express promise of guarded behavior in future, and because he attached to the suppression of these papers a mysterious degree of solicitude. End of quote. All right, Callender is very scattershot in what he says, so I feel no compunction about interrupting him to comment on this. Callender is basing this on Monroe's note in 1792. We left him under the impression our suspicions were removed. But there was no mention in that note by Monroe of suspending or delaying judgment or of concern about Hamilton's future behavior. It's not there. Soon after this pamphlet appeared, Muhlenberg, Monroe, Walcott, and Hamilton all stated that at that December 1792 meeting, it didn't end the way Callender is describing. So Callender is already misconstruing his evidence. Okay. Callender prints 5 short, unsigned, undated notes from Hamilton to James Reynolds, having to do with meeting him and with payments. And Callender deduces, quote, so much correspondence could not refer exclusively to wenching. 5 short notes. No man of common sense would believe that it did. Well, there's a logical fallacy there, isn't there? Callender says Hamilton must be concealing something much worse. Well, there's a logical fallacy there too, isn't there? Callender says if it was only adultery, all Hamilton had to do was say he was tired of Maria Reynolds, and then the blackmail would be over. Never been blackmailed, but I don't think that's how it works. Callender deduces that what Hamilton is hiding must be dealing in certificate speculations, which would be government IOUs. But there was nothing in those statements of 1792 by James, by Maria, by Clingman that said what speculation Hamilton was supposed to have been engaged in. So this is Callender saying, certificate speculations. And if you're wondering, he could not possibly have had firsthand evidence of anything Hamilton was doing in 1792 because he did not come to the country until 1793. Callender says Hamilton's already notorious as an adulterer. And if we have time and you want to ask, this is probably a reference to Angelica, and I will tell you what I think about Alexander and Angelica, which is not. Just to get ahead of myself. Okay, from talking about Hamilton and speculation, Callender jumps to an attack on Hamilton's fiscal policies. He says Hamilton made the government pay $80 million in debt when they could have only paid $30 million. You know what he's talking about? He's talking about payment of arrears and interest. Hamilton said, we promised them 6% for as long as we owed this, and we have to pay them 6%. But Callender didn't get that. He chastises Hamilton for persuading the federal government to assume the debts of the states. I love this phrase, an ulcer in the midriff of American tranquility. And he blames Hamilton for creating the Bank of the U.S., another buttress raised to prop the rampart of corruption. The man has a flair for language. And then he jumps, again, to an attack on the U.S. Constitution, which was written behind closed doors, which he finds very, very sinister. The point is, Callender's history of the U.S. was not written specifically to reveal a moral lapse on Hamilton's part. It's attacks on Hamilton because he's the leader of the Federalists. All right, Hamilton is furious about Callender's history of the U.S. And it's interesting that he doesn't put effort into finding out who released these 1792 documents to Callender. We still don't know that, and I cut any discussion of it for the sake of time. What Hamilton wants is statements from Muhlenberg, Monroe, and Venable that they were satisfied back in 1792 that he had not been speculating. And Muhlenberg and Venable agree right away. We were satisfied. It's fine. Monroe will not give a straight answer. Within a week, Hamilton and Monroe meet in person, and they almost duel. And they have to be pulled apart. Get your pistols, I'm ready. Over the following weeks, Hamilton continues to push Monroe to say that he does not agree with Callender's statements. And Monroe says, well, you know, we might have to just reopen this whole issue. We might have to discuss it all over again from the beginning. Hamilton says, you have been and are actuated by motives toward me malignant and dishonorable. All right. While this exchange with Monroe is going on, Hamilton, like the good lawyer that he is collecting evidence. He does not try to contract James and Maria Reynolds, because Hamilton knows that they are liars and blackmailers, and he doesn't expect honest testimony from them. Also, they're not in Philadelphia. They're not in New York City. They're not checking in on Facebook. Even if he wanted to, it would be difficult to track them down quickly. But he does find someone in Philadelphia who's familiar with Maria's handwriting and swears that the notes Hamilton has were written by her. He also collects a statement from Jeremiah Wadsworth. Back in 1792, Wadsworth says Maria told him, Wadsworth, and General Mifflin about the affair that she was having with Alexander Hamilton. Wadsworth is a member of the Connecticut Executive Council. Mifflin is the governor of Pennsylvania. And this is another really good argument against the conspiracy theories. If the affair with Maria was a lie, then why are there so many prominent witnesses who knew about it or willing to testify that this happened? And why did no one ever leak that secret? Because he had a lot of enemies and most of them outlived him. Another statement that Hamilton gathered was from a man who knew Maria in Philadelphia. His name is Folwell. He said that Maria told him she filed for divorce very soon after Reynolds fled from Philadelphia in December 1792. And as soon as the divorce was granted, which took 2 years, 3 years, it's a slow process at this point. She remarried as soon as she was divorced. Now, Maria comes of a prominent family. She presumably has good connections. She's lived in America's two largest cities, Philadelphia and New York. She knows a lot of people. Do you know who her second husband is? It's Jacob Klingman. It's her ex's partner in crime. It is really difficult for me to perceive her as an innocent in all this if the guy she marries is...
Who's the divorce lawyer?
And the divorce lawyer was Aaron Burr. But I had to cut some things, you know. So back to Hamilton's preparations for his public defense. He has several friends who say, you should just let this go, Alexander, just let the libel pass. But he insists that he's going to publish a defense. And I think he's egged on by the fact that Callender publishes the history of the U.S. in book form. It has been in pamphlets, and in fact, we have none of these pamphlets. They were so ephemeral that they're gone. But he publishes in book form, and you can see Alexander just... So he decides he's going to publish a defense. Drafts it in July. On August the 8th, Eliza had their 6th child, and 3 weeks later, Hamilton published the Reynolds pamphlet. The full title of the Reynolds pamphlet, and this will make sense to you now, is Observations on Certain Documents Contained in Number 5 and 6 of the History of the U.S. for the year 1796, in which the charge of speculation against Hamilton, late Secretary of the Treasury, is fully refuted, written by himself. He opens with 6 pages on the Democratic Republicans. So what? Oh, okay. He says their partisan politics is, yeah, but you talked at the beginning. He says their partisan politics is responsible for the attack on him. He answers Callender's, I'm cutting now, he answers Callender's charges about his behavior as Secretary of the Treasury. He states what he's been accused of. He says regarding the evidence that Callender presents that he's been speculating that James Maria Klingman never once stated what he was supposed to have been doing, what this speculation was, and that they only brought it up when they were arrested for another crime and needed some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. And then he gives his version of events. So this is our phase 1. Maria seduced him. She also played on his honor as Secretary of the Treasury by telling him that James could tell him about a dishonest employee. Hamilton says, I wanted to end the affair, but she seemed in such distress that I thought I'd better do it gradually. James asked for a job in the Treasury. I refused. And then he blackmailed me. Then he moves on to phase 2, the meeting with Muhlenberg, Monroe, and Venable. Says they were perfectly satisfied at the time. And I'm publishing this account because James Monroe refused to agree that he was satisfied back in 1792. The next to the last paragraph in the Reynolds pamphlet is, I've paid pretty severely for the folly and can never recollect it without disgust and self-condemnation. At the end of the Reynolds pamphlet, there are 58 pages of supporting documents, and a third of those are correspondence with Monroe, just trying to get Monroe to say that he was satisfied back in 1792. Okay, aftermath of the Reynolds pamphlet. Some reactions of notable figures. George and Martha Washington sent an expensive gift. This was after they saw the Callender's history and before the Reynolds pamphlet was published. Washington wrote a cover letter, as a token of my sincere regard and friendship for you, and as a remembrance of me, I pray you to accept a wine cooler. Present my best wishes, in which Mrs. Washington joins me, to Mrs. Hamilton and the family. They engraved it on the wine cooler, which is cool. The Democratic Republicans were delighted with the Reynolds pamphlet. Callender wrote to Thomas Jefferson, if you have not seen it, no anticipation can equal the infamy of this piece. It is worth all that 50 of the best pens in America could have said against him. Madison says, the publication is a curious specimen of the ingenious folly of its author. For months after the publication of the Reynolds pamphlet, Hamilton was still corresponding with Monroe and only seems to have given up the idea of a duel in early 1798. So what happened to Hamilton after the Reynolds pamphlet? July 1798, a year after the history of the U.S. was published, Washington insisted that Hamilton be his Inspector General. I'm not going to read that because I'm really rushing now. In 1800, Hamilton's writings against Adams helped Jefferson win the presidential election. In 1801, he was the driving force behind the establishment of the New York Evening Post, a very influential New York newspaper and a voice for the Federalists. And he remained a prominent lawyer. Early in 1804, he made a famous 6-hour speech at the Croswell trial regarding freedom of the press. And incidentally, Harry Croswell, the Wasp's publisher, was in trouble because he had accused Thomas Jefferson of paying James Callender to attack John Adams and George Washington. Alexander Hamilton's family always believed that Monroe was the reason the Reynolds Affair became public. This story was passed down in the family, that Monroe came to visit Eliza. In fact, the first publication of this is 1910, so it's a family tradition. Monroe shows up. He's ex-president, so it has to be 1825 or later. He died in 1831, so both of them are in their mid-60s at this point. And Monroe comes in and gives a little speech. He says, "It was many years since they had met, that the lapse of time brought its softening influences, that they both were nearing the grave when past differences could be forgiven and forgotten." And Eliza responds, "Mr. Monroe, if you have come to tell me that you repent, that you are sorry, very sorry, for the misrepresentations and the slanders and the stories you circulated against my dear husband, if you have come to say this, I understand it. But otherwise, no lapse of time, no nearness to the grave makes any difference." So, wrapping up, my interpretation of the Reynolds Affair is Phase 1, seduction and blackmail. Phase 2, his enemies try to use payments he made to James Reynolds to discredit Hamilton politically. And Phase 3, a Democratic Republican journalist tries to destroy Hamilton's reputation by using documents in the affair to prove that Hamilton engaged in speculation. So in short, I promised you this, I think that Lin-Manuel Miranda got the Reynolds Affair right. I think that Hamilton was conned into an affair and that his enemies used evidence of it vindictively and gleefully. I don't think that it's something we ought to forget or sweep under the rug, because as I say, I prefer my heroes to be on solid pedestals rather than quicksand, and evading evidence puts you right into quicksand territory. But being seduced and then blackmailed is not as bad as sleeping around and getting caught, or using your political power to make a quick buck. I think in mid-1791, when Maria introduced himself, Hamilton was in the midst of getting his financial program passed. He was under stress. People under stress sometimes make stupid decisions. But he gets points with me for fessing up, for trying to set the record straight, and for carrying on. And that's it. Oh, I need this. Look at this.
It's much easier just to tell a nice, light story. It is very, very special. Yes, sir? It's very, very special to have someone like Dr. Dianne who will work so hard, not just to follow a nice, convenient line of history research, but looks at every person, right, from all the perspectives to get the fuller sense. It's a really blessing to us. So when other books come out, take the easier path, deadlines, got to get it out, got to make it interesting in a way, so we'll stretch this. It's the solid work of people like Dianne Durante that form the basis, and that's why our society is so proud to present to her the National Hamilton Advocate.
Let me see. Oh, it's pretty. Thank you so much.
Very special. Our society has existed for 7 years, and I'm telling you, there's very, very, very few people who do this kind of work. It's really a blessing. And if you read in her book, She has all the pages and all. For her to get this down here, to still tell the truth, to give you the perspective is an extra challenge. So now we're ready for about 8 minutes of Q&A. Gentlemen, yes.
Oh! Angelica is timed out at 6 minutes. Do I have 6 minutes? He's brutal. Okay, 2 quick points.
Invite you back for part
2. The affair with Angelica looks more plausible if you think that he was a ladies' man, if you think he was sleeping around. Michael Newton has 2 blog posts, one on his letter to Kitty Livingston, which I think is just flirtatious, and one on the Tomcat comment. And Tomcat did not mean prowling around looking for sex until the early 20th century. So I don't think you can say, and his political enemies accused him of everything under the sun by the 1780s when he was helping ratify the Constitution. They didn't accuse him of being a sexual predator or whatever you want to call it, a profligate. Angelica, I don't think he's short-sighted enough to have an affair with the sister of his wife, because the whole Schuyler clan would have been so done with him. It does not make sense. I think they could excuse an affair with Maria Reynolds, maybe, but not Angelica. I think she just didn't like him. You should read Falwell's letter, which is in the Founders Archives. You'll find it in the Founders Archives. He gives this description of Maria, and he's writing 5 years later. I would have quoted it more, but she says, my husband told me to go make friends with the prominent people and get, but he also yells at me and he abuses me, and so I think that's enough to justify a divorce. Well, they're polarized. I don't know if I could say they're more polarized than we are today, but anything a Democratic Republican said was good enough for a Democratic Republican to believe. Certainly Jefferson was one of those. I think it's, especially in those 9 years when it was uncertain, the people who were willing to buy them were doing a valuable service. Because if you needed the money now, and you had no idea whether or when they would be paid, it made sense to be able to sell them.
And one of the great things is Dianne is very good at communicating with people, so any questions you have, if you discover anything more, Dianne has a lot, and she loves new information.
Yes, I do.
It's been a great gift. Let's thank Dianne.